Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, MIT, Stanford, Caltech, Tsinghua, and Peking U. With a mission to explore the cutting edge of innovation, this summit aims to establish a transnational and multidisciplinary platform that offers insights and generate ideas for the future of humanity. Now, I am happy to announce the opening of our Spring Conference 2021. In the next 2 days, Nobel laureates, leading scholars, business pioneers, entrepreneurs, as well as leaders from international organizations will be sharing with us their research and perspectives towards the world's innovation. On behalf of the organizing committee, I would like to express the sincere gratitude to our sponsors: Taikon Group, Gloden, Gemdale, Gen Fund, Bow Languages, and Jack Academy. Green and sustainable development, deeply driven by innovation, has long become a major topic throughout the globe. In today's opening ceremony, we're honored to have two distinguished guest speakers, Professor Stephen True and Mr. Eric Solheim. They will bring us opening remarks and their views on global innovation partnerships for a green future. Well, first of all, please allow me to introduce to you Professor Stephen True. Professor True is a distinguished American physicist and politician. He's the recipient of the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1997 and received numerous other awards. Professor True was the 12th United States Secretary of Energy. He's currently the Professor of Physics and Professor of Molecular and Cellular Physiology at Stanford University. Over the past decades, he has developed his scientific career to the search for new solutions to energy and climate challenges. Now let's welcome Professor Stephen True to give us an opening remark.
Okay, thank you. Let me share screen and share desktop, and hopefully this will keep to 10 minutes. And so, let me tell you something you already know and go briefly into what I think needs to happen. I'm just going to remind everybody, even though you need no reminder, what's happening with climate change. The average temperature of the Earth has been increasing, much of it since around 1950, 1960. There is various scenarios of what might happen. These are from the IPCC report, and these various scenarios. And depending on what we do in the future, how we can limit the greenhouse gas emissions of the world, what might happen. In order to stay below 2 degrees, what this is telling us is that by 2080, the whole world has to go to negative carbon emissions of everything. Not just electricity generation, but everything. And where I think we're going to be heading is not in a good place, maybe here or here, perhaps 2.5, 3 degrees. Why I'm taking temperatures of just a couple more degrees? During the last period, which was only 1.5 degrees warmer than where we are today, sea level was 6 to 9 meters higher. And this is very ominous. This was taken from another slide I did, just to remind you, 2020 ties the record for the warmest year on record. In 2019, there was a heat wave in Europe. It got to be 42.6 degrees centigrade in Paris, which is crazy. 1,500 people died. 2020, a heat wave in Great Britain, which over 2,000 excess deaths. Last year, 45 million acres burned in Australia. That's 21% of all Australian forests burned down. And record amounts of CO2 releases from Siberia, 9 million acres burned in the United States, and on and on and on. We had the most active hurricane season on record last year. And this year may not be as bad as last year, but it's now being predicted it's going to be very bad. So what we're seeing is, what we've seen in COVID is a very fast motion picture of what happens when countries ignore science, ignore early warnings, And what you see here is these are the global deaths. The purple are the reported deaths. The total deaths that are estimated, because there's an underreporting of these deaths in many countries, including the United States, and even the United States is estimated it's approaching 600,000 people dying, but there may be as much as 900,000. Now, these estimates of India, when I show them to an Indian postdoc I'm working with, he said, no, these are the 600,000 is underestimated. So it's just like crazy stuff going on. And where we're heading is really beyond this danger zone, that red line. And half of that CO2 is expected, half of it gets very rapidly absorbed within a decade between land and oceans, but the rest of it circulates for thousands of years, maybe up to 10,000 years. So it's a very scary proposition. So what can we do about it? Well, in order to answer the question, what can we do about it, you have to ask yourself, where are the greenhouse gas emissions coming from? And this is again from the IPCC report, and you see that a lot of it has to do with fossil fuels, industrial processes, making steel, making cement, things like that. This line over here, methane, this line over here, these are issues where if you look at this stuff, a lot of this greenhouse gas emissions are coming from agriculture and land use. More is coming from agriculture and land use than from electricity generation around the world. So, so if you consider the recent history, this is to 2015, this is the EU 28 or EU 27 plus Great Britain. This is the rest of Europe. The United States and China are in the lead now. With today at 2020, China is twice the US. US is bigger than the rest of Europe. But I'm going to focus your attention on beef and dairy cows because they make a lot of methane. And if beef and dairy cows were a country, they actually emit more CO greenhouse gases equivalent than the entire EU 28. All right, so where can things be improved? Well, we've done a lot of breeding of plants, and you see the native corn versus the modern corn. And we've done a lot of breeding of animals where animals were bred to grow very, very rapidly. They're slaughtered in only a small fraction of their natural lifetime. So the entire circumference of the circle is the natural lifetime of beef, cattle, pigs, and broiler chickens. This is when they're slaughtered. But they grow so fast that the average weight of a pig is 280 pounds at time of slaughter, only 24 weeks from birth. Broiler chickens, only 40 days. And so the livestock have been bred to optimize early growth. Domestic turkeys are slaughtered on 3.5 months. They're so artificial now that they're so breast heavy in US turkeys, they can't mate. So they're mated by artificial insemination. So what is happening? What are some new technologies? Well, one of the things is there's an interest in making plant-based meat products, like meat-like products that taste like meat, because if the whole developing world develops the wealth and appetite that the American diet is, which is lots of meat, the world can't sustain that. And so starting with the rich countries, can you actually develop meat-like substitutes that taste as good or better than plants? The answer is yes. And so this is a nascent technology. A friend of mine started the company Impossible Food Burgers, and there's really a lot of chemistry that goes into this, molecular biology chemistry. For example, the blood-like taste that it comes from eating beef meat, you can genetically have yeast grow those molecules to make this stuff. There's other things you can do in plants. You can make the plants more productive. You can introduce microbes on the seeds of the plants. And when you plant the corn, for example, this is a startup company in the Bay Area where the microbes enter into a symbiotic relationship with the corn. And so you need half the fertilizer. And the hope is you get this to 80–90% of the fertilizer. You want to do this not only for corn, you want to do it for wheat, you want to do it for a lot of things. For rice, can you alter the rice paddy microbes so they are not emitting as much methane? So these are all new technologies that are made possible with modern genetic methods of manipulation of these microbes, and a deeper appreciation for how important the microbes are in the microbiome of the soil and for farm productivity. There's an example of a pivot biocorn with the microbes in the soil versus normal corn, where now the microbes are constantly feeding the plants and they're a lot healthier. What are some of the other things? Well, energy storage. Here's my favorite picture of the best battery we have today. It's a water tower. When the wind blows or the sun shines, you pump water up and you raise it up to a height. And then if you want to generate electricity, you let it come back down. In this case, it was irrigation. But pump storage accounts for 95% of all the stored electricity in the world. And we have to go back and look at all the places where we have existing hydroelectric dams to actually improve that. There's lots of new technologies that can help that come along. Batteries. Well, this is a battery picture of the energy density per unit weight, watt hours per kilogram. The energy watt hours per liter per unit volume per unit weight. And these are some of the new technology batteries. These names up here, Solid Energy, Ampeus, and Zen Labs, they're Scion Power. They're all battery companies trying to make these batteries bulletproof so they can be sold at large volumes in the world. So I've started doing research in battery technology, and one of the things that I've done and published this last year, 2020, is do we have enough lithium to make the batteries we will need when it becomes 60, 80, 90% or 100% of the light car fleet market? And the answer is we think we can do this. So a postdoc that was jointly directed between me and Yi Sui published a paper where you can actually extract lithium from seawater. The cost of the electricity for doing this is essentially negligible compared to the cost of lithium. And the hope is that this can be made bulletproof so you could actually do this commercially. Another thing I'm doing with another postdoc of mine, also in collaboration with Yi Sui and one of his people, is the future battery can't use any cobalt or even nickel. It's too expensive. And so a likely substitute might be sulfur. People have known about sulfur lithium batteries, trying to make them for the last 20 years without success. There's some new tweaks, approaches that we're trying. We don't know if it's going to work, but so far it looks very promising. We've certainly we're about to submit a paper where we set the world record in terms of longevity for lithium metal sulfur batteries, but it's still got to be improved before it can be commercialized. So again, this is another example of innovation. Finally, clean electricity will be very cheap in the near-term future, maybe down to 1 cent to 1.5 cents a kilowatt hour in the best places where there's lots of sun or lots of wind. And that means you can think of electricity taking materials and making energy storage materials or other materials with electrochemistry. And so there's a lot of interest in whether you can make hydrogen, not from taking natural gas and steam reforming, which releases a lot of CO2, but can you make hydrogen via clean electricity and other things? There's a lot of innovation going on. Big companies and startup companies and laboratories, including mine, are trying to look at this. Ideally, what you want to do is you want to take CO2 captured from the air or captured from power plants or cement plants. You want to decarbonize cement and steel making, but you're still going to have some point sources, and you have water and it's very important. You're going to have to eventually capture CO2 from the atmosphere, put in energy inputs, either electrochemically, thermochemically, photochemically, biochemically, you name it. And what you want is you start with hydrogen and CO to build up liquid hydrocarbons. And that's very, very important, because for long distance transportation where you need very fast refueling, you definitely need liquid hydrocarbons. That's still the best energy carrier we have today. So with that, I hope I didn't speak too long, but that gives you an introduction of some of the possible technologies that people are thinking of, including myself, but also how important this problem is that we all face. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor True, for the very informational sharing. Now, please allow me to introduce to you our next distinguished guest speaker, Mr. Eric Solheim. Mr. Solheim was the former executive director of the UNEP and Under Secretary General of the United Nations. Prior to that, he was the Norwegian Minister of Environment and International Development. He has an inspiring career focusing on environment and the development in government and international organizations. Now let's welcome Mr. Eric Solheim, the Green politician, to give us an opening remark.
Thank you so much. And I'm so honored to speak to such a distinguished audience of young entrepreneurs, people who will innovate and make all the new practices which we need to transform this world. Professor True did set out some of the big challenges facing humanity. Global poverty, still 1 billion people are living in abrupt poverty. Climate change is already happening and an enormous challenge for the future. COVID-19, of course, has created enormous pain to so many people, and they are destroying nature, some of the most precious ecosystems on the planet. But still, even with these enormous problems, I believe there is never, ever been the same room for optimism as today. And that's because all the main global actors are now moving in the same positive direction to change the world in the right way and to bring the change we need. Let me start with the United States of America, which is still the most powerful nation. What President Biden has put forward, I mean, Stephen Drew and Obama did a great job. But what Biden is doing now is the greenest policy ever implemented in the United States of America, and it's deep green. Think of the infrastructure package, 2,300 billion American dollars. That's an enormous amount of money, and it's going into charging stations for electrical vehicles, going into investment in batteries, in hydrogen, in solar and wind, and it's fantastically green. Think of the fact that President Biden has said that he will create 4 times as many charging stations for electrical vehicles in America than there are petrol stations today. And I've been traveling quite a lot in the US. I've been to 40 states in the US. I never saw a shortage of petrol station as a main problem in the United States of America. Now there'll be 4 times more charging stations for electrical vehicles. Moving on to the second biggest power in the world, to China. Then President Xi Jinping last year said that China will go carbon neutral by 2060 and will peak its emissions in the 2020s, created an enormous enthusiasm in China. And China, of course, already is by far the biggest solar nation in the world. Half of all new installed solar power in the world is happening in China alone. By far the biggest wind power, by far the biggest on batteries. 99% of all electric buses in the world are running on Chinese roads, and 70% of all high-speed electric train, which is the greenest way of transport, is running in China. So China has the technological ability and the political system to drive change at a scale which is unprecedented. Then moving on to Europe, where the European Union has decided that environment is not a small thing on the fringe for the Minister of Environment and the environment NGOs. It's front and center in European integration. We want to create a green Europe, and we want to use environment as the unifying policies of Europe. And I can see this from my viewing point. In a small nation like Norway, we are not even members of the European Union, but it's Brussels rather than Oslo, which is now driving Norway in the green direction. Unfortunately, India, Prime Minister Modi had in the past many plans of big coal power plants. Now they are putting into the shelves one by one, and Modi is focusing on solar energy, has formed the International Solar Alliance with France. India has the first all-solar rail station in the world in the northern state of Assam. It has the first all-solar airport in the world in Kerala in the south. And the New Delhi Metro, which is one of the biggest metro systems in the world, will be fueled by solar in the next few years. And of course, when these main drivers of the global economy, the United States of America, Europe, China, and India, in concert are going green, we will be able to solve it. The only factor which can distract us is if we make geopolitical problems overtake ourselves, so we cannot cooperate. And that's why we should tell all those in the United States who speak negatively about China, all those in China speaking negatively of the United States, or anyone else who try to create problems, please, let's cooperate. Because together we can resolve all the major problems. If I allow someone to split us, it'd be very, very difficult. What's on the role of innovation? It's enormous. Because there was a very interesting debate last week when John Kerry, the former Secretary of State of America, and Mr. Biden's climate envoy, where he said that, yes, we will solve the climate problem to a large extent with technologies which are not yet there. Then people said that will be too slow because we need to use the technologies which are already available. Who's right? I think both. Many of the technologies which we need to use are not still fully developed. They will be developed, but we also have an enormous amount of technologies which are already developed, which is just to start using. Think of solar. The price of solar energy is now 10% of the price about 10 years ago. Solar is cheaper than coal everywhere in the world. New solar station in many parts of the world is even cheaper than keeping the old coal stations. So the ability to switch to have a win-win policy, good for the economy and good for ecology at the same time. The old debate, do we want to develop or do we want to take care of Mother Earth, is over. We can do both develop and get prosperity to everyone in the world while doing it in an environment-friendly way. But then we need to innovate. And innovation is about all Stephen Chu spoke about, the enormous potential for innovation in business. Solar energy has developed fantastically. Offshore wind is one of the technologies with very, very few negatives. You can even think of charging ocean crossing ships and going from America to China or from India to Europe. They can charge in the open sea from offshore windmills floating in the ocean. It's just a matter of making this at scale so it be cheap enough and then it can be implemented. Hydrogen, batteries, all these technologies are there. They are in the infancy and they will be developing fast. But the potential for innovation in business and for young people to add to these innovations are tremendous. Adding, 5 years back, no one could think of a beef, as Stephen Chu spoke about, which tasted exactly as well made from vegetables than that made from the animal kingdom or a chicken. But now the chains, McDonald's, Kentucky Fried Chicken, they're all introducing plant-based materials, and I think we have a huge potential. So we need innovation in business, and there are many more. But we also need political and citizen innovation, new ways of fighting. Because unless people stand up and tell the political leaders and business, we cannot live this way any longer, we need to change. Change will not happen. And also here, I see a lot of interesting innovations. In Europe, young people innovated the generation extinction, the school strikes. Yes, true, young people have been out in the streets before, but this was new ways, and Greta Thunberg became kind of a symbol of this new way of fighting for a new generation in Europe, and then it spread to the rest of the world. And the European Commission at the political level has invented a taxonomy a new system to price investments in such a way that to drive the investments in a green direction, and it has enormous power to transform Europe, and it's a new way of doing politics. Moving on to China, I also see numerous inventions. I mean, China, for instance, have introduced the river chief system. That is that for every part of every big or small river in China, there is a go-to person, a chief. You get the phone number of that person, and if you see oil spills or if you see pollution going into the river, well, you find a number where you can call and get some action to clean up. And you've seen a fantastic cleaning up of rivers in Jiangsu or Zhejiang in central China. True, the Germans did the same in the Rhine, except that the Europeans did in 30 years, what the Chinese have done in 3 or 4 years through this river chief system. And China now also recently launched the so-called red line system, which is the best in practice system for conserving nature in areas where there are a lot of people living, like say in the Yangtze River Delta or in the Beijing-Tianjin area. So we see political and business innovation coming from America, from India, from Europe and China. That's why I'm so optimistic, and young people are, of course, drivers of that change. Finally, let me quote a person which is not one of my favorites, but the Russian revolutionary Lenin once said that there are decades where nothing is happening, and then there are years where decades are happening. And I think the COVID-19 year was such a year where decades were happening. We're in a completely new place now, where there is the once in a generation chance to get it right when it comes to climate and the environment.
Thank you, Mr. Solheim. Well, just like what you just mentioned, global innovation and partnerships are the necessities for the world's green future. But what this green future would look like? What are the next big trends for the innovation and technology in the energy and environment? More insights will be disclosed from the dialogue between Professor Stephen Chu and Mr. Eric Solheim. Moderator for this session will be Tracy Chan, the former anchor of CGTN. Now, Tracy, I'll give it to you.
Thank you very much. Now, good morning from Beijing, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us this morning for the UA World Innovation Summit 2021 Spring Conference. Let me start by briefly introducing myself. My name is Tracy Chang. I'm a financial journalist turned beauty influencer / entrepreneur. Now, it's a pleasure to be moderating this extraordinary conversation, and I am honored to be joined by two remarkable gentlemen, Dr. Stephen Chu and Mr. Eric Solheim. Now, let me start by saying that I got very excited after learning about whom I'll be having a conversation with this morning, because I have been following both of your careers for years, and I admire your professional achievements very much. However, as the president of Young Conservatives on campus back in college, I think it's needless to say that both Dr. Chu and Mr. Solheim hold very different political ideologies than I do, which makes today's conversation, in my opinion, even more meaningful, as I wanted to serve as an example that people with drastically different political beliefs could still sit down and have a very civil, meaningful discussion about the things that we all care about, which is something I think people around the world, particularly people in the United States, should strive for. Now, as a mother, I believe the overwhelming majority of us just want to leave the world a better place for our children and generations to come. And of course, environmental issues should be on everybody's priority list. Now, let me start by this conversation by asking Dr. Stephen Chu, when we talk about a greener future, we can talk about a Green New Deal or not. Everybody envision of a greener future is different. What's yours? What do you see for the next 30 years?
Well, I would like to, I think it's possible that we can increase prosperity around the world and drastically reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But there are these other issues that Eric talked about. I mean, the inequity in wealth distribution, lots of things. But how do you best address these things, I think, is really at the crux of what is best. Now, I personally think, for example, that innovation actually begins, it's got to be picked up by the private sector. And in the United States, it's actually the private sector that actually drives a lot of this stuff. But there is a role in the government, a very important role, and that is, how do you actually encourage that? And Eric talked about these things, and the real question, the political debate would be, some people say you want to encourage it differently. Other people say no, just take a very activist role and spend lots of money and help it come along. And that's a question. Honest, good people who really care about making the world a better future. How is the fastest way to get where we think we need to go, namely zero carbon emissions, as soon as possible? And I hope you will agree, but I think if we wait for the natural way of doing things, time is running out. And so what's the best way to encourage this prosperity, get all this? We have lots of issues surrounding us, and what's the best way, and what's the best way in policy, what's the best way in stimulating research, and so that's what I think, and maybe one could argue about that, but I think many people on both sides of this spectrum do, as long as we're not debating is climate change real, and we're running out of time.
Absolutely, I agree with you to a certain extent. The problem with majority, I don't want to say majority, but at least half the country in the US perhaps don't feel the same kind of urgency. So I want to talk about this with Mr. Solheim. What do the public think in Norway? Do they feel that this is something that we have to solve for the next 5 to 10 years in order to avoid catastrophe? Or it is not something actually top people's list of most things that they're most concerned with?
I think there is a difference between Europe and the United States, because the polarization in the United States, where Republicans, for some very hard to understand reasons, have decided to not go along with climate change debate. While, a few years back, John McCain was a very strong fighter against climate change, because it was President Nixon who started the Environment Protection Agency in the United States. It was George W. Bush who really did fight acid rain. So the Republicans have a proud history fighting for the environment in the United States. So they should come back to that. In Europe is very different, because the main conservative parties of Europe, the Tories in the United Kingdom or the Christian Democrats in Germany, are as active on climate as the social democratic or more left-wing parties. I still recall when I was in the Norwegian government, I was in the red-green government, and then we had an excellent relationship to the Labour government of Gordon Brown in the United States. Then the Conservative won the election in the United Kingdom, and we were afraid now we will not be able to work with them any longer. And it was no change. The day after, we could work as well with the Tories of the United Kingdom as we could with Labour. So Stephen chose better to explain how this polarization happened and how the United States can get out of it. But fortunately, we don't see the same in the main European nations like Germany, United Kingdom, the Nordics, or in France, where conservative parties are all fighting in the right way against climate and environment destruction, in my view.
So, Dr. Chu, explain to me, because I don't think it's fair to say that a conservative wing or more right-leaning wing in the United States, they don't want a greener future, or they don't want clean water or air for our children. The problem is, I do believe the majority of their constituents don't think it's something that should be on top of everyone's priority list. How do we close that gap? And also, I believe environmental issues are so politicized these days, which makes it harder to strive for a universally agreed upon agenda. What's your take on that?
Well, first, I think Eric was right about reminding us of Republicans and the conservative stand traditionally over decades was actually conserve the planet conservatism. And it went awry, and it especially went awry in the last 4 or 6 years. by feeding a certain populism, but because people, they want to be optimistic. So along comes someone and said, no, these are not real problems. The weather is just weather. It'll turn back. President Trump said this many, many times. It's not really real, and it's changed. Yes, it's changing, but it'll change back, things like that, which is kind of look what he did with COVID-19. He said, no, this is not real. It's just a thing. It's completely under control. And so he was bringing good news to people that happened to be not true. And a lot of people want to reach out and accept good news. So I think of responsible leadership, no matter whether you're a liberal or conservative, said, no, you can't make up stuff. And now, do we have to cure this problem in 5 or 10 years? First, it's impossible. It's at best going to be cured in 3 or 4 decades. And so, because the transformation takes so long, for example, suppose we get to 100% electric vehicles by 2040, and hopefully, you can be at 50% by 2030, right? Just pretend. That means 50% of the cars are internal combustion engine cars, which will last 15 or 20 years. So automatically baked into the system, because of the long replacement time of energy infrastructure, where cars are fast, but power plants are 50 years, you have this very long time scale already built in the system. It's not like your cell phone. And for that reason, that's why I think time is running out, because we've got to get moving a little bit faster, but don't expect it to be cured in 10, 20, 30 years. By 2050, there's an aspiration, but I personally, think it's a great aspiration, but how do we do that is the real issue. So
Absolutely.
The polarization, though, is this happened in Europe in the 20s and 30s. Along comes someone who tells them good news, who to blame for your troubles, your economic troubles. And we should be proud. We should be proud to be Germans. Look what these other countries did to us and humiliate us after World War I. This is not good. So this is history playing back on itself in an old playbook. And also an old playbook is make an outside enemy, start a war. It takes away from your own political troubles. And I think we're seeing a little bit of this with two sides in the Middle East. So this is, not responsible leadership.
And we're definitely seeing history replaying right before our eyes. And Mr. Solheim, I want to ask you about this narrative in the United States. I'm curious to see how the European population sees this. Because the conservative wing will talk about, sure, you're asking people to make changes. You're asking them to give up hamburgers or dairy products, which is something we could sit down and talk about. These meat replaced products are actually good. However, they will show the other wing. They're showing the celebrities or environmental zealots. They were flying around the world in their private jets. And when you juxtapose these two situations together, I can't blame an average Joe for thinking, okay, you're a hypocrite. These intellectual elites and business elites are flying around the world in their private jets, educating me to give up my hamburger. What do you think? Do they have this kind of narrative in Europe? If they do, how do you resolve that conflict?
I think one of the big mistakes green people and the environment movement has done is to say that, oh, it's so costly, so difficult to change. And then I want to finger point to you, you need to change, you need to be a better morally person. And that doesn't work, and it's not true. Because we are now in the position that we have all the win-win propositions, all the technologies which are cheaper, makes us more prosperous, improve our lives, and are good for the planet at the same time. That's the win-win solutions. Unfortunately, the two most powerful persons on the planet has fully understood this. If you look to Joe Biden, President of America, I have never heard him speak about all the enormous problems coming from climate change. Of course, he's absolutely aware of how Stephen Chu told us. that is setting out fighting climate change as a huge opportunity for American people to create new jobs, to get out of the problems, to fight poverty, even to uplift some of the minority communities. So it's an enormous opportunity rather than a problem. And if we move on to China, Xi Jinping has launched in China, the president, the slogan which is green is gold. What does that mean? It means that if you go green, you will not be poorer, you will be richer, and you will create any number of jobs. And we must avoid these guys who try to fool us. There are 5 times more jobs in the United States in solar industry than there are in coal. Still, some people are allowed to run around speaking as if you need to protect the jobs in coal to keep the American people happy. Yes, you need social policies for people who are affected by change, true. But overall, the green transformation is making society better. It's win, win, win. Good for the economy, good for the life of people, and good for the environment at the same time. And that's a message which we can bring on also Republicans on board, I hope.
So can I make one comment? The liberals, most liberals aren't. It doesn't do anyone any good to wag your finger saying unless you become a vegetarian or vegan, you're morally reprehensible. This is just terrible. Number one. Number two, you'll never legislate what people are going to eat. That's a personal choice. And so, but okay. So there's a younger generation who says we're going to drink oat milk instead of dairy milk because it's good for the planet. But then also, what is a medical fact is that it's been shown that the stuff in the oat milk is actually helps lower your blood pressure. Okay, and so forget about the planet. You might want to think about it for your health, but if you don't like the taste, that's okay too. It's your choice. In fact, we have this big debate in my own home. My wife likes dairy milk. We're trying to get her interested in oat milk, and especially Oatly, because now on the board of directors. and so I know a little bit about the science that goes behind this and things like that. And she said no. And so she goes around looking for information saying why it might be bad. It's like, she's a PhD from University of Oxford in physics. and it's a confirmation bias. And so we just don't talk about it. She doesn't want to drink oat milk. That's fine. You're not going to change people's lifelong habits, okay? But if you want to think about win-win, being better for your health and this and that, there could be other reasons, okay? But more, wagging moral fingers at each other is not the way to go about this at all.
Dr. Cho, I want to ask you, do you believe what Mr. Solheim just said? Because I think that's somewhat arguable to say that going all green will yield immediate economic results. Because I think majority of people think that, okay, we have to strike a balance between conserving the planet versus economic growth, sustainable growth. What's your take on that? Can we see immediate results?
First, I think what Mr. Solheim said was, Joe Biden is saying, if you do this and you do this transition, it will lead to better jobs and lead to better things, okay? Now, but it also depends on how you do the transition. And I think there's not gonna be any daylight between us on that. But if you do things in a not good way, let me tell you a not good way. Germany closing its nuclear reactors way before its natural lifetime. This is not good. but they were getting pressure from the Green Party on the left that nuclear power is so bad. And so what did Germany end up doing? It ended up building coal plants. And now, as an advisor to the Helmholtz Association, which is, and I'm the chair of over 7 years reviewing their energy program, 5 billion euros a year, I can see firsthand, how are you going to do this when you Germany has wind in the north, but solar is terrible. And if they want to get off of coal, are they going to make the entire German industry collapse where they produce stuff that requires power? So it's hard, okay? And, I'm just taking nuclear. That's not what I've done, but there was so much political pressure from the left that Angela Merkel, who knew better, said, okay, she caved, okay? But that's part of politics, so it happens. But I don't agree with, the extremes on the left and right are not so good for how to get things done.
It's never so good because all issues, even something that we can all agree upon, like wearing masks, can be politicized. And all of a sudden, people who were agreeable to wearing masks stopped wearing them because they think it's making a political statement, which is very unfortunate. Mr. Solheim, I want to ask you what happened in the United States, in Texas, this past winter. Of course, there's a power outage, and many people blamed on the structure. We're using electric system or the system failed. They're saying, okay, this is the greener path you chose, and now this is the price you pay. What's the energy structure like in Europe, particularly Norway? And do they have anything similar to what happened in Texas this winter? And if so, how do they resolve the problem?
I think this problem in Texas was politicized and not real. To the contrary, Texas, being a Republican state in the US, is going green at a rapid speed. They have enormous investment plans for solar in Texas now, because they have huge areas which are well suited for solar. They're investing heavily in wind. So Texas will turn itself into a really powerhouse of the renewable energies in a Republican state. In Norway, we have 100% hydro in our electricity system, so we are somewhat different from the rest. But the transformation is now enormous, and I think the best argument for what I said, that there is a win-win proposition out there. We can provide prosperity and jobs while going green at the same time. Well, yes, it's Joe Biden and Xi Jinping. They believe in it. But maybe even more importantly, business is believing in this. And now we see the main companies of the world going green at a rapid speed. When President Trump tried to stop environmental progress in the United States, the business was not behind him. It was not one big company raising its hand saying, we agree with you, Mr. President, that climate change is not real. They all, Apple, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, all of them came out and said, no, we happen to disagree. We need to take this seriously. Microsoft has promised to go carbon neutral by 2030. They have even promised to compensate for all emissions in the history of the company. They promised to be a non-plastic company, which will not bring plastic waste to society outside. Moving on to Europe, IKEA, the big Swedish furniture maker, are far ahead of any political leader when it comes to a circular economy, meaning an economy where you can hand in your furniture and get new ones, and the old furniture will be repaired and resold. Volkswagen, another giant in European industry, just said the debate is over. We won't spend 1 calorie improving our gasoline motors or engines, because we know the future is electric. We will go all out electric. We will make more than 20 different Volkswagen cars, which are all electric. So when the political leaders believe we can make this transformation, and the main companies, both in American, Chinese, and European industry, they all believe in it. So we are in a very fortunate moment where the old you need to choose is over. We have the win-win policies.
Dr. Chu, do you agree with that? I think it's much easier to do such things in China, as everybody has a somewhat uniform belief in certain things. But in the United States, you're sort of taught to question the authorities and to think otherwise, to question the validity of the statements they're making. And then also, as an entrepreneur, these days I know when consumers make their choices, if two products are identical and one is more environmentally sustainable, of course, I'll choose the one that's more green for a better future for our children and also that. But majority of them, as soon as you mark down slightly the product that's not so green and make it cheaper, they will forget about environmental issues. They're thinking that I'm not willing to pay extra to go green. I don't even know whether I'm going to see the results or my children are going to see the benefits of me making this choice. How do you resolve that conflict? Does the government need to step in and sort of just close the gap and pay the gap for people, or even make the greener products cheaper? And are people doing that in the United States or around the world?
Well, okay, so let me, before I answer that, I want to go back a little bit to Texas. Texas was a very interesting example because, yes, wind failed. It was in the winter, so you're not banking on solar, but the gas system failed. But what was driving the Texas market was two things. First, ERCOT wanted to be kind of an island, and so because they wanted a free market within ERCOT, and as soon as that happened, the people who designed the pricing of energy and what you do were very proud of it, because in their macroeconomic model, the free market would make the average cost of electricity go down. And so they said it worked the way it was supposed to work. You know, having a blackout a couple of days every other year is okay. What they didn't really figure out, and an MIT professor who, economist who helped them design their program, said, no, this was, it worked, you know, that's tolerable. So then what happened is that the backlash was, no, people died. And all of a sudden, you know, bowing to the free market, which is what the entire system of energy pricing was doing, they're beginning to think maybe it wasn't good, because as you may know, the price of electricity went up, you know, to like $10,000, $9,000, thousands of dollars per kilowatt. You know, instead of, you know, it just went crazy. And it said, and then what happened is after the back, you know, it's like all the price of commodities, because everybody looked at supply chains lag in COVID, the prices are going through the roof now. The free market does not build in insurance, is what we're seeing. Just as the free market doesn't build in a long-term vision of something, the free market is not going to respond to what might happen 50 years from today at all. The net present value discount goes to nearly zero. And so at some point, the government may have to step in and say, wait a minute, who's going to guarantee that you don't have a blackout for 4 days and people die? What used to happen in the United States, we had vertically integrated utility companies, and if something went wrong like that, you knew who to blame. Nowadays, you can't. You know, it's next day bidding. The electrical distribution companies the utility companies are distribution companies, and they're next day auctions for most of the energy. So and in a macro sense, the economists are right. The prices go down, but you're not paying for insurance as much. And so this is a really an interesting issue in my mind, because I've been thinking about this for a couple of decades. Just as the free market that, you know, doesn't do anything about fishing, international fishing, right? It's not going to solve that. Everybody just fishes as much as they can before the next fisherman takes their fish. So there has to be some regulatory thing about this. And so I think, but these are important issues. What you say about price is absolutely true, especially in the United States. They're very price conscious. You know, before diesels were found out to be dangerous from the NOx and particulate matter, long before that, Europe was going towards diesels because it was cheaper to own and operate. But the first costs were a little bit more expensive. The United States was staying with gasoline for, you know, their very first cautious price. Now, the good news is, I don't think the government needs to step in and help a meat substitute company or an oat milk company compete against dairy cows. It's going to be easy. What has happened in milk is that the margin, first, the dairy lobby is very strong, but the margin for milk is really low. And what happens is they figured out that they're going to tell the supermarkets and the local grocery stores, you're only allowed to make itsy bitsy on milk. So what do? They say everybody buys milk, so we'll put it in the back of the store. So you have to walk to the back of the store to buy the milk, and they want you to buy other stuff. So with companies like Oatly, you know what they're doing? They say, no, that's crazy. We can make this stuff a lot cheaper, and we're going to let you make more money per you, the store owner, the supermarket. Okay, because in the end, we know we're going to make milk substitute a lot cheaper than real milk. It's much more efficient to grow oats to make a milk-like product than it is to grow a cow. And so I don't think in many of these instances, I'm looking forward, not maybe in a decade, where $20,000 car, 350-mile range, same price as an internal combustion engine car, and you can refuel 5 minutes to 200 miles out of the 350 miles. At that point, you would be crazy not to own one, because the cost of maintenance and the cost of the fuel would overwhelm an internal combustion engine car. You're just saying, why would I want to drive that thing when I'm coming out of my wallet? Forget about climate change. Forget about anything else like that. It's now a better product. We went from the Stone Age to the Metal Age, not because of politics. We went to a better solution. We don't look at the stones on the ground and say, if it weren't for these crazy liberals, we wouldn't have these stranded assets. So I talk about technology because I think technology will be a part of the solution. It's going to make a cheaper, better thing. And it goes back to the win-win stuff. And I personally think that, plant-based substitutes of food that are better for your health and cheaper to produce. And then now oat milk does not taste like dairy milk, but a lot of people are actually beginning to like it better. My wife is not one of those. But I think, and maybe they like it because they think it's better for the planet, but actually maybe not. Maybe they just like it, right? I mean, some people like it. You like it, right? Some people generally like the taste. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And
I like the taste.
Yeah.
But the problem you said is right. When people believe something, they have an idea first. They take a position and they go look for things that confirm.
Confirmation bias. My wife is constantly telling me everything that says, one sentence negative about this is like, it has as much sugar as milk. And she says, see, it's not so good. Says, well,
the social media platforms made it worse because it's only showing you things that you want to see.
Well, unfortunately, the media platforms, you can go into your own sound chamber and listen to you and your friends that reinforce what you want to hear. And that's a terrible thing of democracy, right?
Mr. Sohan, I want to ask you this. So I'm curious to know that in Norway, can you legislate something such as this stuff that people can eat? Because Dr. Chu said you can't legislate to say, oh, we're going to stop selling. Not in the United States. In Europe, is it possible? And is that an idea? Because as Americans, to us, that idea is crazy. You can't tell me what to eat. But in Europe, is this something that could even be in question? Saying the government saying, no, we're going to limit how much beef you can sell in restaurants, or the size of the burger you can order. They try to ban supersized McDonald's in the United States, facing a lot of backlash. Is that something that's even talked about in Europe?
No, I don't think we should talk about that. I think we should take a very different approach, and that is, how can government help introducing the new technologies? Are there ways of making, say, the plant-based hamburgers cheaper? Are there ways of making introductory offers so that people get used to it? And let me take the electrical vehicle policy in Norway as an example, and it has been enormously successful. Now, 60% of all new vehicles which are bought in Norway are electric, fully electric. In 2011, when we started, it was 1%, and that basically has been rising by 10% every year. That was because we changed the taxation system so that electrical vehicles became cheaper relative to the gasoline vehicles. And we gave some introductory offers to electrical vehicles that were, for instance, allowed to run in the bus lanes so that you can get cheaper, faster to a job. Not a costly policy, just to make some changes. We in Norway has the highest, by far the highest penetration of electrical ferries in the world. How did that happen? It happened because we introduced a NOx policy, which said that if you have huge NOx emissions, you have to pay a levy. That levy, dollar by dollar or kroner by kroner, went to those companies who made the inventions, who changed into less emissions. And that meant if you were a backward company doing nothing, well, you paid a lot of levy and you get no subsidies from the state. If you were a forward-leaning ship owner who wanted to change into electric ferries, well, you paid less in the levy and you got more subsidies from the state. There was no cost in this. It was a zero-sum game. Because no one was prohibited from anything, but it was enormously effective. And now the ship owners are so proud to say that the people running these electric ferries are much more happy because now they can go back to the wives or husbands and tell them we are part of a green revolution in the world. They said they're taking better care of the ferries. There's enormous win-win from these changes. And we should get rid of this kind of thing that you need to prohibit everything. You need government to regulate markets. I listened a few years back to Stephen Drew's former boss, Barack Obama, and he made, in my view, a very important point. He said that when I came into politics, Obama in the 1980s, the two main environment problems in America. It was acid rain, and it was the hole in the ozone layer. And then he said, no one are discussing these issues any longer. Why is that? They're resolved. We are bringing the ozone layer back. By 2050, we'll be back in the shape it was before we started destroying it. And acid rain is not a real problem in any developed nation in the world. How did this happen? Citizens demanded change. Governments regulated markets. And it was left to business to make all the innovations needed for this change. No one became poorer. There's much more air conditioning in the world than there were before this change had happened. People are cool in many more places, except it's not done with the chemicals which destroyed the ozone layer. So that's, again, we must look for these win-win propositions where we gain both economically and ecologically at the same time. That's normally happening when brave governments regulate markets and you leave it to business to make the innovations which are needed.
I think incentive is a key word here. How do you incentivize businesses to make these innovations and create a win-win environment for consumers and businesses as well as government is a question. Dr. Chu, why do you think it's so hard to educate the public on the win-win trajectory of green initiatives? And also, what do you think is going to happen to innovation to bring us to the next level of development? We ultimately want to grow the pie bigger. You envision a glucose economy, I've read. Is that even plausible at this point with the technology we have now?
Well, I don't know how I got this label, and then it's been tagging me around. There's not going to be a glucose economy or a hydrogen economy or anything like this. I mean, we're going to the extent that we could grow plants to begin to replace chemicals and plastics and things, it depends on the economics, how good the technology is. Are people going to pay quadruple the price or double the price? Well, some may be forward-leaning people, but as I think all agree that most of the people will make decisions based on price, folding in environmental consequences for sure. But in America, it's price first. So I think that the way, the acid rain is a good example of that. By the way, Bush won, Clean Air Act, Republican. And when this was being contemplated, and also catalytic converters, first in California, and industry really was against it, and we're saying, no, it's going to cost the consumer so much more money for a car. It's going to cost for electricity, all this stuff. And they put out all these very strong statements of how much it would cost. Okay. And what actually happened was once it was decided that starting with California, which is a huge market, we're going to have catalytic converters, then the engineers and scientists got really smart. And the costs were a teeny tiny fraction of what they were predicting. On both of these instances, I look back at the history of catalytic converters, they're saying, oh, it's going to cost, thousands of dollars more. No. You look at really what it goes into the price of a car that they sell, it's like $100. Okay, it was in the second or third decimal, it's like out of $20,000, it's $100. Acid rain scrubbers, a quarter, a fifth, a tenth of the price. Very quickly, within a few years, it just plunged. And if you look at, was there a blip in the energy costs? Not really. Okay, so so what was going on? People didn't want to do it, so they put out lots of stuff. And I'm not saying that they knew they were lying. I think in many instances they believed it, but they weren't counting on innovation and engineers and scientists to figure stuff out. And just like, the chlorofluorocarbons that were, DuPont had a solution, but now there's another solution. No, it's not the ozone layer, but it's still a very potent greenhouse gas. And now they're working on something that gets rid of that part of it. At least you're not having a catalyst that destroys the ozone layer, and not only do you want a refrigerant that's not a potent greenhouse gas, because small amounts of that leaking in the atmosphere are very bad. But you also want better refrigerants for hotter countries, because most of the people in hotter countries are poor, but they're getting richer. And the refrigerators are less efficient, and the air conditioners are less efficient. So now the search is on to get a better technical solution that is not a potent greenhouse gas. And so I'm an optimist in that sense. I think science can be very ingenious when it has to do something. I really believe that. I really believe that. And this is a major problem. And so I shifted, I hope shift focus of a number of scientists and say, if you're going to think about a problem, this is maybe a set of problems that's worth thinking about.
Absolutely. And Mr. Solheim, we all know that COVID-19 practically affected everybody's lives in this world. And many people say, okay, this is good for greener initiatives, because now people are seeing when we don't protect the environment, something like this happens. But on the other hand, people are saying, okay, we could care less about green initiatives now. We're facing a global pandemic, and now we got to deal with economic growth. People got to put dinner on their tables. What do you think this pandemic's effects are on our greener plans?
I think that debate is already over. The conclusion is that the COVID year made us a lot more determined to fight climate change and environment destruction than we were when we went into that year. Again, coming back to Lenin, this was the year where decades happened. And when you see the determination of the main powers in the world, the United States, America, and China now, it's in a completely new world compared to where we were just a few years back. And I think very briefly, there are three main lessons from the COVID-19. One, leadership matters. Those nations with good leadership and good policies have suffered much, much less than others. Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Singapore, China, Vietnam, all these nations have had very, very, very few deaths from COVID-19 due to good leadership, and leadership matters. Secondly, we are in it together. Pandemic which started in China, then moved to Italy, then moved to the United States, then moved basically to the rest of the world. Now India is the epicenter. There is no way we can just fight it separately. Only if we come together, we will succeed. And what happened with vaccine, though there are huge problems making vaccine available for developing nations at the moment, still what happened was enormously optimistic. I mean, when the Chinese put out the DNA for the virus in early January, it took American companies 24 hours to make a vaccine. Then, of course, they needed to test it and make it commercial, true, but making it was immediate. And again, it was based on this cooperation. So leadership matters. We are in it together. And finally, we have seen nature bouncing back during COVID-19 in a way no one really contemplated. I mean, there have been penguins walking down the streets of Cape Town. There have been bears in the streets of Barcelona, deer in the streets of the big Japanese cities. In northern India, people who haven't seen the Himalayas for 20 years because of fog, because of pollution, now could see the brilliance of the Himalayas from their hometowns because they love it and they want it to continue. In the United States, some of the big national parks, which are a huge treasure, they said this is the wildlife has a party in the national parks during COVID-19. So let's keep the positive message is, of course, that when we remove the problem for nature, nature has an enormous ability to bounce back very, very fast. So let's keep this. I mean, we cannot keep it immediately, but we can work very, very hard to take better care of nature. And then we will see nature bouncing back basically everywhere at very high speed.
You're absolutely right in saying that leadership matters so much in terms of controlling a pandemic. But I want to get your take on this, Dr. Chu. When they found the first case in the U.S., I kind of had this ominous feeling because I believe, I grew up in the States and I know the culture. I know that people are going to politicize this pandemic, politicize this virus, and then people are going to defy whichever government is in power and telling them to do. And I knew this was going to be something that's very hard to control for the Americans. And China, of course, with a very different political structure and a far superior decision-making process for the government, they can try plan A through D in a week, where the Americans, if you don't want to make one decision, it's going to take a year of debate to achieve that, which makes it very inconvenient to control a pandemic. And right now, people are saying, sure, you're asking everybody to wear masks, but do you think about the environmental impact of everybody in the world wearing several masks all day and all the other environmental impacts that we are experiencing? What do you think this pandemic's impact will be on our greener initiatives? Do you think it's positive or actually is a negative? Like the same question asked Mr. Solheim. Do you think people will be like, okay, I'm worried about paying for rent. Don't talk to me about the environment right now.
No, I would agree with Eric. I think the debate is over. The fact that it was politicized more in the United States and Brazil and a few other places. And sometimes even in forward-leaning countries, when you get bad advice, if you look at the difference between Norway and Sweden, there was a big issue. But I'm not saying it was politicized. I think that there was whatever. But in other places where you had people not believing what experts actually knew, that becomes very dangerous. And so that was unfortunate. I don't think the United States is that bad, but if we had a different leader, we've had other situations where very different. If you look at the United States response to Hurricane Katrina and Tropical Storm Sandy, there was a big difference. And I was there at Tropical Storm Sandy. The President of the United States was meeting with me, Director of Homeland Security, and FEMA an hour each day for 4 days in a row, trying to figure out what to do. This is the President of the United States, because he took his job seriously. I didn't see this in Bush 2, and I certainly did not see it in Trump. Trump couldn't care less about what experts were telling him about what's happening with COVID. He just chose to ignore it, right? And so the federal government was just not there. And he said, states, you figure it out. And the only good thing he did do, which he did do, is someone said we're gonna help the drug companies. Well, one of the drug, Moderna, Pfizer said no, we're going to do this ourselves because they wanted to say we're not going to agree. If the government helps you, then the government may ask you to start giving stuff away. So, but in any case, I think if we had a different leader, we would have responded to these things differently because when I was watching Obama do these things and health threats, it was a very different situation. And just as responses to natural disasters like hurricanes, or if you call a hurricane natural disaster, it was in the past, but maybe in the future, maybe, human fingerprints on it. But in any case, I think I will want our political leaders in any country to care about the citizens and care about this stuff. And businesses have interests, and like it or not, it's very understandable that if you're the established business, right, the incumbent, and then you see something coming along that could have a political issue to nudge people or make people go the right way through policies, taxation policies, you name it, policies, you're gonna struggle very hard to survive. Right, that's very natural. So whenever there's change, antibodies come out when you're an incumbent. That's just part of life. In the United States, because a major part of the income of the United States happen to come from fossil fuels, right? It's a loud voice. Now, Norway, I don't know how they got to where they got, but it was really wonderful. They're for a long while a fossil fuel net producer. They took all that money and they said, instead of getting rid of taxes for like Alaska did, they said, we're going to put it in a sovereign wealth fund and we're going to use that money to invest. And then we're going to use that so we can actually, on the long term, help the country, which was amazing, right? And we see in the United States, more income, there's oil in Alaska, we make things free. And then when oil runs out of Alaska, now they're in bad economic straits. So there was this long-term vision in Norway, which I just thought was amazing, that you like to see in other countries. If you have a windfall, don't spend it away, invest it for the long-term future. And so, these things are, policies do matter, but in the long run, now the good news is in Europe, if I look at Statoil and BP and Royal Dutch Shell and Total, they know what's happening. They know that I'm an advisor to Royal Dutch Shell. 50 years, if they're in the fossil fuel business, the world's in deep trouble. And they are really looking hard to change, and really change. In the United States, not so. I would say if I look at Chevron or ExxonMobil and the others, no, they're just trying to slow something up, okay? They may put in ads in papers, but behind the scenes in Congress, they're trying to slow it up. And so there's, again, a difference in what's going to happen. When first the Germans, then the Japanese started making better cars, how did the United States respond? They went to Congress and said, put a tariff on the cars, okay? Or make them build the cars in the United States. So Honda starts building Camrys in Maryland. Germany starts building cars. And they said, they can't compete with us. We can build cars in the United States. We have labor unions, we have all this other stuff. Anyway, so they started making better cars in the United States. And so at the last resort, they said, we should be making better cars ourselves. Now, that competition actually made GM and Ford make better cars. But
when I think about environmental protection, when I think about the environmental protection on cars, immediately I think about Tesla. I guess that car sort of was born because I don't know whether it's because people want to go greener, whether there's policies in place that encourages people to drive electric cars. But Mr. Sohan, what's your take on it? And what kind of policies or regulations do they have in place for the Nordic region for electric cars? And also, when we think about Elon Musk, when he decided to make Tesla, was environmental protection his top priority, or he just wanted to make something more efficient and more convenient for people? So that's a question we all should ask. Should we leave it to the people, or should we leave it to the government? How is it like in Norway?
You need all these three for change. You need citizens demanding change, you need government regulated markets, and you need the enormous power for change and innovation at scale in business. And I mean, at the end of the Cold War, Mr. Gorbachev, the then Russian leader, went to Berlin and spoke to the East German communists. And he said, it's very dangerous to be late to history. And that's what's facing some of these companies who don't change. Tesla is now 10 times more valuable than General Motors. General Motors is making many more cars still, but the market price Tesla 10 times more because they believe Tesla is the future. And if General Motors and Ford are not able to change fast, they will go bankrupt. I mean, remember Kodak? They had 150,000 jobs, mainly in New York State in America. It doesn't exist anymore. It's a history museum. Why was that? They didn't understand digital photos. Nokia, the Finnish cellular phone company, they were the biggest in the world. They went from the biggest to the 10th biggest in 2 years. Again, they didn't understand the revolution Steve Jobs brought by smartphones. So if you are not part of this change, you will simply lose markets and you will be complete failures. And some companies simply will come too late to history. And I believe some of the big American oil companies very likely are in that category because they are not able to make that change into the renewables, which are in the future. Still not yet clear whether the future car will be made by the car maker or the future car may be made by Huawei in China or by Apple in the United States, because they bring the entertainment technology which you would need in a self-driving car. That's not clear. Maybe the car makers, maybe the technology companies. When it comes to renewables, probably the many startups, which are now medium-sized solar companies, are better placed to be the key drivers of the renewable energy rather than the oil companies. But some of the oil companies, Total as a European example, are driving change at a rapid scale. So there will be a race here whether the oil companies are able to change or the newcomers will take the market. But those who come too late to history are the sure losers in history.
I see. A question for you, Dr. Tu. I've got to ask you this question because my husband asked me to do so. He's a huge fan of yours for years. He wants to know whether nuclear fusion is something feasible in the future as a sustainable source of energy.
I don't know. I don't know for two reasons. First, but mostly it's, will it be economically viable? And what will make it not economic, and it depends on technology development. And what we are learning from fission, which first we forgot to learn how to build these things on budget, on time, number one. Number two, the capital cost of a fission gigawatt reactor is now an $8 to $10 billion venture. That becomes, if you have a delay in construction or project management of a couple of years, you're now in a very bad economic situation that's hard to come out of. If you imagine a future fusion reactor being 10 or $20 billion, the capital risk appetite is, you need the government to say, we will back you. Because even conglomerates of power companies aren't willing to do this, because, and I watched this in Shell. They built a gas chemical plant in the Middle East It was supposed to be about $10 billion, and it turned out to be $12 or $13 billion. The economic whole was amazing. The willingness to invest in $10 billion projects is like night and day to investing in one $10 billion project, because you're putting all your chips in there. And so one of the things is, even if fusion scientifically works, it's a huge risk to get it on budget, on time for the first few reactors. Before you have confidence, you can build them on budget, on time. I have to tell you a joke. There's a fusion scientist. He works his whole life on fusion. And his friends ask him, "You're spending your whole career, you're a brilliant scientist working on fusion. Do you ever think this is going to become a reality?" And he says, "In my lifetime, no, but it's so important. If you get this, it's a compact energy source. It's much cleaner than fission, that it would. So I'm willing to do this." He dies. He goes to heaven. He's at the gates of heaven, and he says, "I would really like to ask God a question. Normally this isn't done," says St. Peter, "but you've been such an exemplary person on earth, we'll allow you." So he's put in front of God and says, "God, I need to know, will fusion ever become economically viable?" There's a pause. And then she says, "Maybe so, but not in my lifetime." Anyway, I don't know.
I gotta say that I really admire the scientists who work tirelessly at something they don't know that they will ever see any economic return, or even any return in their lifetime, including the scientists working on the string theory. Many people say it's a dead end, yet a lot of people still put in so much time and energy towards the project. Mr. Solheim, this is a question I want to ask you. It's coming from our audience. I think this is a great question. They're saying that we have been seeing EU countries trading electricity, oftentimes renewable electricity, across borders. Can we expect such trans-border green electricity trade to be expanded to a global scale? What are the biggest barriers, and also what's your opinion on the prospect of the potential global grid?
It's a great idea, but for sure it will take time. I think there are enormous benefits by integrating the energy system in Europe, by integrating the energy system in the United States. I mean, that was, I guess, Stephen, you can correct me, one of the failures with Texas. Some of the states had the separate energy system, not really able to take in the entire energy potential of the United States. And in China, of course, it's a lot of the same, and some of the most developed states of China are at the coast, while some of the most energy-rich states are like in Inner Mongolia, with enormous potential for wind and solar, or other parts of the north and the west. So in all these major regions of the world, we can have enormous progress by integrating large-scale European, American, and Chinese energy systems. If in the future they can talk to each other and be also more globally integrated, it would be good. But I think we should focus on these kind of regional integration first, because that's much nearer in the horizon. Because in Europe, a huge potential for the future may be to integrate with North Africa, where there are lots of land which could be potentially used for solar farms. I mean, solar farms are demanding huge areas. Wind farms also demanding areas. So you could potentially think of these being linked up. But my short-term answer would be, let's integrate Europe, let's integrate the United States, and let's integrate China and India. That would be an enormous service by itself.
Can I add a little bit?
Go ahead.
There's the other issue is the energy security issue. And so if you're getting a lot of energy from a politically unstable place, I mean, we saw this in the oil shocks in the early 70s, where, the Middle East got really irked at, let's say, U.S. support of Israel, and they shut off the thing. Okay, and what resulted was the developed countries said, we can't be held hostage, so we're going to require each country to have about a 6-month supply on their shores. So you have energy security, right? And so that you have a stock. Electricity energy storage is way too expensive for a 6-week supply, let alone 6-month supply. I mean, we have peak load shifting. We don't even have day-night. We're not even close to day-night in the US. And so the trouble with that is if you're cut off from electricity, lots of bad things happen. I mean, we've gotten spoiled. Lights, refrigerators, cell phones. And if you have a political instability in North Africa, which is lots of cheap land and the best sun in the world, you know, what are you going to do about that? Yeah, it's to their benefit, you know, because that's their product that they sell, solar electricity. But you need political stability or some way of storing. Once you have storage electricity, but you're not going to get a 6-month supply or a 3-month supply anytime soon. And that's a real problem.
Absolutely. And last question, Dr. Chu, I want to ask you about your opinion on the Green New Deal, the squad of the left wing of the Congress is pushing now. And then also many people say if the Biden administration pushes green initiatives too hard, they will face political repercussion come 2022. Do you agree with that? 2 questions.
Well, the short answer is yes. If they do something that pushes too hard, that's too much beyond an economic envelope, that really, you know, because of the cost-conscious United States, the United States citizens are not willing to pay what Germany or Europe, or, you know, Northern Europe is willing to pay. That's a reality. And so I wish they would be able to. I would be willing to do it, but you know, but in any case, so if they push too hard, they can do something. Germany's trying to figure this out. You know, the price of domestic electricity for homes in Germany doubled. Why? Because Germany said that the heavy industry was so dependent to be competitive, so they shifted the cost of electricity on the consumer, private consumer, rather than the industry. Otherwise, you know, the car manufacturing, all the stuff, the chemical plants, BASF, it's all very energy intensive stuff. And again, go back to nuclear. Why did they do this? But in any case, and Eric may not, you know, anyway, just don't build any new ones. You don't have to build new ones, just don't close on the old ones. But in any case, if I am a little worried that there will be a backlash if you do it too aggressively. I want to go.
What about the Green New Deal? The Green New Deal.
Yeah, there's elements I don't fully agree with now, but the overall direction and goal I do agree with wholeheartedly. Okay, so and you know, this isn't the venue for developing little fine points of this or that. And I do think policy is absolutely essential. If you let natural things take their course, it's not going to go fast enough. It really isn't. And that I'm absolutely convinced of. And lots of my politically conservative friends are also absolutely convinced that that is true.
Yeah.
I mean, George was alive. You know, I became a friend of his. I admire this man greatly. And man, you know, there's no daylight between George Shultz and me.
Exactly. Do you have anything to add to that, Mr. Solheim?
No, I may be a little bit more optimistic because I believe that so many of the new alternatives are now coming so fast down in price that the idea that American consumers will have to pay more is somewhat historical. I mean, for sure it was true in the past, but now solar energy, wind energy is much cheaper. And the main reason for that is of course scale, because scale drives down price. When Prime Minister Modi of India introduced all of Indian program for LED lamps, the price fell by 90%. Why was that? Well, the difference between making a few thousand and making 300 million or something. The same we have seen with solar, the price has come so fast down because of these twin forces of innovation. Many innovations made in the United States, but the scale being brought in China and India, basically, which has brought down the price hugely. And of course, an electrical vehicle is not more costly than a gasoline vehicle. In the lifespan of the vehicle, it's much cheaper. You save money by buying an electrical vehicle. And of course, when now Volkswagen, General Motors, all the big companies will launch huge number of different electrical vehicles at a low price, you will see them penetrate the market, I think, very fast.
Actually, it's an interesting thing about electric vehicles in the United States. The antibodies have come out. Why? Because the car dealers are afraid they're going to lose their business. They don't make money selling cars. They make money servicing cars. And they make a couple $100s in the car, but they convince their consumers, the customers, that they have to go to, all these, tune-ups and this and that and timing belt changes. And the cost of ownership, if you're going to keep a car for 10 or 15 years, it's so lopsided. Forget about the cost of electricity versus the cost of gasoline. The salespeople try to steal the customers away from electric vehicles. They see tragedy. Their income goes away. I mean, I have a car and it's got a little warning light. And when it beeps that, something is happening, it says, I want to make another mortgage payment, or I got to send my kid to college for the car dealer. It's a joke, but the antibodies in the United States and car dealerships I see it full force. It's part of life. Yeah. And that's why the electric car companies are trying to bypass them or separate dealerships, because they know this is happening. And if GM or Ford is investing gobs of money in electric vehicles, they don't want the car dealers to steer the customers towards something else. It's very interesting watching this.
It absolutely is. I gotta say that although my husband will be very disappointed hearing the answer that you say you don't know whether nuclear fusion will ever be something reliable
commercially viable
in the future. But however, I still think I'm leaving today's conversation more enlightened and optimistic than ever. I think whether you're a conservative, you're a liberal, you're American, you're Chinese, you're European, it doesn't matter. I think we can all agree that we want a sustainable future for our children. And it's really the way of how to get there is something that we should sit down and talk about. So here, I think really we need to focus on two keywords. One is education. People need to know a lot of things that we talked about. I think the majority of people in this world don't know what's going on with green energy initiatives or the planet, or the situation our planet is in. Education is key. And the other one is communication. How do we communicate effectively to make people understand and get on board instead of antagonizing them, making them feel like they're morally inferior? These are the two things that we should all focus on in order to move on to a greener future. Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Tu and Mr. Solheim. What a brilliant conversation. Now back to you.
Thank you, Professor True, Mr. Solheim, and Tracy, for bringing us such a fantastic and thoughtful dialogue. Thank you all for joining us today. Please be noted that in our next sessions, we're going to have keynote speeches from Professor Gregory Winter, Neil Gershenfeld, and David Sinclair, as well as panel discussions on innovation and carbon neutrality. We look forward to seeing you all there. Please stay tuned with U8 World Innovation Summit. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you
for doing this.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Mr.
Bye.
Solheim.
And for Tracy, your masterful job.
Thank you, Dr. Tu. Huge fan of yours. Very satisfying conversation.
Bye.
Bye.